3 knocks meant you had 2 minutes to run. That's what the cousin Jacks told us when they arrived in Schuylkill County in the autumn of 1827. And by winter, 17 men were dead because they didn't listen fast enough. I was one of the fools who laughed at them. My name is Samuel Webb, and I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened in those mines. I was born on Pennsylvania soil, bred on American common sense, and I had no patience for old world superstitions. When those Cornish miners stepped off the wagons in Pottsville that October morning, with their strange accents and strange rituals, I thought they were bringing nothing but foolishness to our coal fields. I was 24 years old. I'd been working the anthracite seams since I was 14. I knew stone and timber, lamp oil, and black damp. The smell of a tunnel about to flood, and the sound of a support beam ready to snap. I knew mining the way a farmer knows soil, and I didn't need some superstitious foreigners telling me about spirits in the rock. The cousin, Jacks, that's what they called themselves. Every Cornish miner claiming to be cousin to every other arrived with the October rains. 43 men, hired by the mining company because they had experience with deep shafts and hard rock that we, Pennsylvanians, were still learning to navigate. They came from Cornwall, from tin mines that had been operating since before Christ walked the earth. And they brought with them rituals that seemed, to us, like pure madness. Before entering any shaft, they would stop at the tunnel mouth and speak aloud to the darkness. Not prayers exactly, requests, permission to enter, knockers. We mean no harm to your realm. We take only what we need. Then they'd leave something behind, a piece of bread, a few crumbs of their lunch pasties, sometimes a pinch of tobacco, for the knockers, Thomas Penrose explained when I asked. He was their leader of sorts, a man of about 50, with arms like iron and eyes that had seen too much darkness. They live in the deep places, lad. Been there longer than any of us. You show them respect, they show you mercy. You mock them well? He didn't finish the sentence, just turned and walked into Wolf Creek Colliery. Leaving his bread crust at the threshold, we American miners thought it was hilarious. Jacob Miller, my bunkmate, did impressions of their ritual in the boarding house at night, kneeling before his bed and begging the mighty knockers for permission to sleep. We laughed until our sides hurt. We were practical men, and practical men didn't believe in spirits. On November 3rd, I learned the price of that laughter. The night shift in Wolf Creek Colliery started at 8 in the evening. By 9:30, we were 200 feet below the surface, working by the light of oil lamps that turned the darkness into something thick and alive. The air down there tasted of coal, dust, and timber rot, every breath leaving a film of black on your tongue. You could hear the mountains settling around you, creaks and groans. The slow conversation of stone under impossible weight. I was working the north wall with 5 other men, Jacob Miller, Sean O'Connell, David Hartman, and 2 brothers named Georg and Wilhelm Schneider. Germans who spoke broken English and kept to themselves. The Cornish miners worked the south wall 50 yards away through the main shaft, and we could hear their picks striking rock in steady rhythm. That rhythm stopped at exactly 9:47. I remember the time because I'd just checked my pocket watch, annoyed that we still had 3 hours left before the shift change. Then I heard it, 3 distinct sounds, metal on stone, coming from somewhere in the north wall. Not the sound of mining. Too deliberate. 2 measured knock. Knock, knock. What's that? Wilhelm Schneider lifted his lamp, casting shadows that danced across the coal face. Nothing, I said, though my hands had gone still on my pick. Just settling. Sound came again. 3 knocks, clearer this time, like someone rapping their knuckles against the other side of the wall. From the south shaft, I heard sudden commotion, voices shouting in Cornish, the clatter of tools being dropped. Thomas Penrose appeared in the main shaft, his face drained of color in the lamplight. "Out!" he screamed. "Everyone out now!" 3 knocks. 3 knocks. The Cornish miners were already running, their lamps bobbing like fireflies as they scrambled toward the main shaft entrance. I watched them go with a mixture of confusion and contempt. "They're mad," Jacob Miller said beside me. "Running from some noise in the rock, It's probably just water finding a crack, David Hartman agreed, though his voice wavered. Or rats. Sean O'Connell, the youngest of us at 19, had his pick raised but wasn't swinging. Maybe we should finish our shift, I interrupted. We're not children scared of the dark. It was just settling stones. The Schneider brothers exchanged a look, and Georg said something in German that sounded like a prayer. But they didn't leave. None of us left. We were Americans, goddammit. We weren't going to be spooked by some Cornish fairy tale. We went back to work. For 15 minutes, the only sounds were our picks against coal, our breathing, the occasional grunt of effort. The Cornish miners had all evacuated. We could see the main shaft was empty, lit only by the safety lamps they'd left behind in their panic. We were alone in the deep, and I felt a surge of superiority. Let them cower above ground. We would bring up twice the coal and earn twice their respect. Then the ceiling groaned. It wasn't a settling sound. It was the sound of something massive shifting, of weight redistributing in ways that timber and stone were never meant to accommodate. David Hartman looked up, his lamp raised, and I saw his face change in the yellow light saw. Understanding and terror arrive in the same instant. Run, he whispered. The north wall exploded. I need you to understand what a cave-in sounds like. It's not one sound, it's a symphony of destruction. First comes the crack of timber, like bones snapping under pressure. Then the roar of displaced air, a wind that shouldn't exist 200 feet underground. Then the coal itself, thousands of pounds of it, moving like a black wave, and under it all, a sound like the earth screaming. The darkness became total. My lamp was gone, knocked from my hand or buried. I didn't know which. I could hear screaming Jacob's voice, I think, or maybe Georg Schneider's. High and terrified, and then suddenly cut off into a wet sound that made my stomach turn. I was thrown backwards, slammed into something hard, and then I was falling through spaces that shouldn't exist, tumbling through a gap that opened and closed around me like a mouth. When I finally stopped moving, I was on my back in a pocket of space barely large enough to contain my body. I couldn't move my legs. Something heavy pinned them, and when I tried to shift, pain shot through my left ankle that made me bite back a scream. I could breathe barely, but every breath filled my lungs with cold dust that tasted like grave dirt. Jacob. I called into the darkness. David. Anyone? Silence. Then, from somewhere far above, the sound of more stones settling, and I knew with sick certainty that the collapse was complete. The tunnel was gone. The north wall was gone. My friends were gone. I lay in that darkness for what felt like hours, just trying not to panic, trying to conserve the air in my tiny pocket of survival. I counted my heartbeats. I prayed to a God I'd never paid much attention to before. I thought about my mother in Philadelphia, who had begged me not to go into mining, and I wished I'd listened. That's when I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It came from my left, where solid coal should have been. Clear and deliberate and impossible, my breath caught. I turned my head as much as I could in the confined space, pressing my ear to the coal. The knocking moved. Now it was behind me, then to my right. Then above, it was circling me. I tried to call out, thinking it might be rescuers, but my throat was too dry, my voice too weak. The knocking continued, steady and patient, moving around my tiny prison like something taking its time, like something that had all the time in the world. Who's there? I finally managed to croak. The knocking stopped. In the absolute silence that followed, I heard something else that sounded like breathing, but wrong, too slow, too measured. And then, so close to my head that I could feel the vibration through the coal, I heard something that wasn't quite a voice, more like a whisper in a language I didn't recognize. Words that sounded like stone grinding against stone. Then the knocking started again, but different this time. Not 3 knocks, 4. Knock, 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 knock. I lay there in the dark, unable to move, unable to breathe. And I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was making that sound was not human, had never been human. And it was pleased that I had stayed behind when the Cornish miners ran. The rescue came 4 hours later. I heard them digging long before I saw light, the sound of picks and shovels, voices shouting in English and Cornish. When they finally broke through to my pocket of air, Thomas Penrose was the first face I saw in the lamplight. He looked at me for a long moment, and there was no triumph in his eyes, no relief, just a deep, tired sadness. "You heard it while you were trapped," he said. "It wasn't a question." I nodded, unable to speak. They pulled me out carefully, my ankle broken, my body bruised and cut but alive. Jacob Miller, they found an hour later, crushed beneath a support beam, dead before he'd had time to be afraid. David Hartman was beside him, his skull caved in by falling coal. The Schneider brothers were deeper in the collapse, and it took 2 more days to recover what was left of them. Sean O'Connell survived with a shattered arm and burns from a lamp that had exploded near his face. 2 days of recovery, 5 men underground, 2 dead, 3 alive. The mine superintendent called it a tragedy, but not unusual cave-ins were part of mining, he said. The price of progress, but Thomas Penrose pulled me aside while the company doctor wrapped my ankle. And he said words I'll never forget. "It knows you now, lad. It marked you when you didn't run." "Marked me for what?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just shook his head and walked away, leaving me with questions I didn't want answered and a fear I couldn't name. That evening, I learned that Wolf Creek Colliery had a history. Mine Superintendent Harrison showed me the accident log when I demanded to know why the Cornish miners had known to run. The book was leather-bound, water-stained. It's filled with entries in multiple hands spanning 18 months, 23 deaths. All in shafts where knocking had been reported first. "But look at this," Harrison said, pointing to a separate column. "Penrose and his men have been in 7 separate collapses. Not a scratch on any of them. They always know when to evacuate. Always. How?" I asked. Harrison closed the book. "They say they listen to the warnings. They say the knockers protect those who show respect." He paused, uncomfortable. "I don't believe in spirits, Webb, but I believe in patterns. And the pattern is clear: men who mock the warnings die. Men who heed them survive. So the knocking is real," I said. "The knocking is real," he confirmed. "What causes it? I don't know. Gas pockets, maybe. Or settling stones that create acoustic phenomena. But it's consistent. 3 knocks means the collapse comes within 2 minutes. They've timed it." "What about for knocks?" I asked, remembering the sound in the darkness. Harrison's face went pale. "Where did you hear about 4 knocks?" "I heard them. While I was trapped," stared at me for a long moment, then opened the ledger again, flipping to a page near the back. "For knocks," he read, "has been reported 7 times in company records. Every man who reported hearing it died within a month, usually in a separate accident. Usually alone." My mouth went dry. "What does it mean?" "Penrose says it means the knockers have chosen you. That you're marked for collection." I left the superintendent's office with my new crutch and my racing thoughts, making my way back to the boarding house through evening rain. The other miners avoided my eyes. Word had spread fast Samuel Webb had ignored the warning, gotten 2 men killed, and somehow survived what should have killed him too. That night, I lay in my bunk, listening to the rain on the roof and trying not to think about what I'd heard in the darkness, trying not to wonder what marked meant, trying to convince myself it was all coincidence, acoustic tricks, imagination born of fear. Then I heard it: knock, 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 not. Not from the mine 200 yards away. From directly beneath my bed, I leaned over the edge of my bunk, heart hammering, and looked underneath. In the faint moonlight from the window, I could see the floorboards clearly. Fresh coal dust covered them in a thin layer, black against the wood. We were nowhere near the mine shafts. The boarding house was built on solid ground, no tunnels beneath it. No reason for coal dust to be there, but there it was, ranged in patterns I couldn't read, like something had traced symbols in the dust. And in the center of those symbols, 3 small indentations in the wood. Evenly spaced, the marks of knuckles striking from below. Something had tunneled closer. I didn't sleep that night. And in the morning, when I put my boots on, I found coal dust inside them too. The Cornish miners had rules, 14 of them. Written in no book, passed only mouth to ear. And I learned every one after I found the 15th miner, who broke them face down in 6 inches of water. Drowned in a tunnel that had been bone dry an hour before, but I'm getting ahead of myself. the week after the collapse. I couldn't return to the mines. My ankle needed time to heal, the doctor said, though we both knew that wasn't the real reason I stayed above ground. Every night, I heard the knocking beneath my bed. Every morning, I found fresh coal dust on the floorboards, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate spirals and circles that meant nothing to me but felt like they should. The other, American miners avoided me in the boarding house. I'd become something contaminated, touched by whatever lived in the deep places. Only Sean O'Connell, recovering from his shattered arm, would sit with me at meals, and even he couldn't meet my eyes when we spoke. "They're saying you're cursed," he told me one evening, his voice low, "that you should have died in that collapse, and now something's following you around, waiting to finish the job." "What do you think?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment. "I think I heard things down there I can't explain. And I think the Cornish miners knew to run when we didn't. That counts for something. It counted for everything. That's why on the 8th day of my recovery, I found Thomas Penrose in the town's only tavern and sat down across from him without asking permission. "Teach me," I said. He looked at me over his ale, those deep-set eyes measuring something I couldn't see. "Teach you what, lad?" "How to survive. How to hear the warnings and live. Whatever it is you Cornish miners know that we don't." "You mocked us," he said simply. "You and your American friends, laughing at our rituals. 2 men are dead because of that mockery. I know." The words tasted like ash, and I'll carry that the rest of my life. But I'm asking now. I'm listening now. Whatever's in those mines, it marked me, and I need to know how to survive it. Penrose studied me for what felt like an eternity. Then he pushed his ale aside and leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are rules," he said. 14 of them, passed down from the old country. My grandfather taught my father taught me. Break them, and the knockers take offense. Follow them, and you might be allowed to work in peace. But understand this, Samuel Webb. Once you're marked, the rules might not save you. They might just slow down what's coming. Tell me anyway." He did. "The first rule, never whistle underground." "Whistling imitates their sounds," Penrose explained. "It's mockery, and they take it as invitation. You whistle down there, you're calling them to you." And leave offerings at every shaft entrance. "Food, mostly bread, bits of meat, whatever you can spare from your lunch. They hunger," Penrose said, "though not for food as we understand it. The offering is respect made manifest. Third, never enter a new tunnel without asking permission aloud. Speak to the darkness. Acknowledge its prior claim to the space you're invading. Fourth, if you hear knocking in patterns of 4, run immediately. Don't gather your tools. Don't warn others. Just run. For knocks means they've chosen. The warning time is over. Fifth, never mock the sounds or those who believe in them." "You learned that one the hard way," Penrose said. And I couldn't argue. He continued through all 14 rules. Never take more coal than you can carry in one load. Never work alone in unmapped tunnels. Never ignore the smell of roses underground. It means bad air. He said, "Gas that will kill you. Never speak ill of the dead while below ground. Always leave your lamp burning when you exit a shaft. Never turn your back on a tunnel entrance. Never count the knocks aloud. Always spit 3 times when entering and exiting. Never work on the anniversary of a collapse. And never ever go deeper than the knockers allow." 8. "How do you know where they allow?" I asked. "You feel it," he said. "A pressure in your chest, a wrongness in the air. The wise miner stops digging when that feeling comes. The foolish miner digs deeper. The foolish miner doesn't come back." I absorbed every word, committing the rules to memory. But one thing nagged at me, said 14 rules. "What's the 15th? Penrose's face went grim. "There is no 15th rule. That's the point. Some fool always thinks he's found a loophole, a way to game the system. There's always a 15th rule that someone invents in their arrogance, thinking they're cleverer than 3,000 years of tradition, and that's when the knockers show them exactly how wrong they are." Jack Morrison arrived in Pottsville 2 weeks later. Fresh off the boat from County Cork, full of bluster and bravado and absolutely no respect for anything he hadn't personally experienced. He was 26, built like a bull, with red hair and a laugh that could fill a room. The mining company hired him. Immediately, strong backs were always needed, and the Irish were willing to work for less than native-born. It's Americans. I tried to warn him his first day underground. We were descending into Shaft 7, a newer excavation that had just reached profitable depth. The Cornish miners had already performed their ritual at the entrance, asking permission, leaving bread spitting 3 times. Morrison watched with a smirk on his face. A superstitious lot, aren't they? He said to me as we walked past, "All that mumbo-jumbo for some rocks and coal." "It's not mumbo-jumbo," I said quietly. "The rules exist for a reason. You're one of them now, are you?" He clapped me on the shoulder hard enough to make me stumble. "Gone native, have we? Next you'll be leaving cookies for the fairies and dancing around oak trees." "I'm serious, Morrison. There are things down here. There are rocks and coal and timber and nothing else," he interrupted. "I've worked mines in Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. Same thing, everywhere, superstitious old-timers trying to spook the new lads. Well, Jack Morrison doesn't spook." To prove his point, he started whistling. A jaunty Irish tune, loud and clear, echoing off the shaft walls. Every Cornish miner in earshot stopped working. Thomas Penrose appeared from a side tunnel, his face pale with fury. "Stop that," he barked. "Stop that right now." Morrison just grinned and whistled louder, adding a little dance step for good measure. "What's wrong, old-timer? The spirits don't like my singing?" "You're marked now," Penrose said quietly. "God help you, but you're marked." Morrison laughed all the way down to the coalface. He whistled while he worked, whistled during breaks, whistled on the way back up. For 3 days straight, he whistled in every shaft he entered, daring the knockers to do something about it. On the 4th day, he went into Shaft 7 alone during the lunch break. Said he wanted to get ahead on his quota. The shift foreman allowed it. Morrison was a good worker. Despite his attitude, and the tunnel had been thoroughly inspected that morning. Solid rock, good timber, no water seepage, no gas pockets, safe as any mine could be. 15 minutes later, one of the Schneider cousins brought in to replace his dead brothers went to fetch Morrison for lunch. He came back running, face white, screaming in German. We found Morrison face down in 6 inches of water that had appeared from nowhere. The tunnel was flooded for a length of about 20 feet. Water so cold it made your bones ache to touch it. Morrison lay in the center of it, his mouth and nose submerged, his eyes open and bulging. His hands clawed into the mud as if he'd tried to drag himself forward, even as he drowned. "The tunnel was dry this morning," the foreman kept saying over and over. I checked it myself. Bone dry. We pulled Morrison's body out, and the mine doctor performed an examination right there in the shaft. When he cut open Morrison's chest, water poured out gallons of it, impossible amounts, far more than lungs should hold. And when the doctor tested it against the water still pooling in the tunnel, his face went slack with confusion. "It's not the same," he said. "The tunnel water is surface runoff, rainwater that seeped through somewhere. But the water in his lungs..." He paused, shaking his head. "This came from deep underground, very deep. There are minerals in it, salts and compounds I've never seen before. This water has never seen sunlight. There are no deep springs connected to this shaft," the foreman said. "We surveyed before we dug. The water table is 60 feet below us, but the water was there anyway. And when we looked up at the ceiling where it was still dripping, we saw something that made no sense. The rock was limestone, dense and non-porous. Water couldn't seep through it, couldn't penetrate it, and yet there it was, dripping steadily from solid stone. Each drop hitting the ground with a sound like knocking, dot, drip, drip, drip. 3 drops. Always 3. Thomas Penrose stood at the edge of the water, staring down at Morrison's body, and I heard him whisper something in Cornish that sounded like a prayer. When I asked him what he said, he just shook his head, whistled. Penrose said. He mocked. "He broke the first rule, and he broke the 5th, the knockers answered. "But how?" I demanded. "How does water appear in a dry tunnel? How does it fill a man's lungs from the inside?" Because they don't follow our rules, lad. We follow theirs. That night I couldn't sleep. Morrison's bulging eyes haunted me, the way his fingers had dug into the mud. The impossible amount of water that had poured from his open chest. I kept thinking about what Penrose had said. They don't follow our rules. We follow theirs. At midnight I heard a knock on my door. When I opened it, I found a note slipped underneath, written in shaky handwriting. Old Cemetery. North Edge. Come alone. Trevorrow William Trevorrow was a legend among the Cornish miners. 63 years old, 40 of them spent underground, survivor of 7 major collapses. He rarely spoke to anyone, American or Cornish, and he worked the deepest shafts where younger men feared to go. If he wanted to talk to me, it meant something important. I found him sitting on a moss-covered headstone, smoking a pipe, his lamp turned low. He looked older than 60-3-ancient, really, his skin like weathered leather, his hands gnarled from decades of holding picks and shovels. "You want to know how to survive?" he said without preamble. "Penrose told me you've been asking about the rules." "I need to understand," I said. "Understanding won't save you, but I'll tell you anyway, because you're marked, and marked men deserve to know what's coming." He took a long draw on his pipe. "The rules aren't protection, lad. They're a bargain. We follow them. The knockers allow us to work. We feed them respect. They feed us warnings. That's how it's been for 3,000 years, since the first men dug into the earth for copper and tin. But why? What are they?" Old Trevorrow said simply. "Older than human memory. They were in the deep places before we came, and they'll be there after we're gone. But here's what you need to know. They don't protect us out of kindness. We made a bargain with them, long ago in Cornwall, before the Romans came. We feed them, respect them, acknowledge their prior claim to the earth. In return, they warn us when the stone is ready to give way." "And the price?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "In every collapse, one miner must stay behind. A volunteer, if possible. A chosen one, if not. That miner dies so the others can live. It's always been that way. The knockers require their due." Stomach turned. "You're saying someone has to be sacrificed?" "I'm saying someone always is," Trevorrow corrected. "Whether you call it sacrifice or bad luck or being in the wrong place at the wrong time, the knockers choose. We just try to ensure it's someone who volunteers, who understands the bargain. That way, the death means something. That way, it satisfies them. That's murder. That's mining," he said flatly. "You think cave-ins are random? You think it's chance that determines who lives and who dies? The knockers control the stone, lad. They've always controlled it. We're just mice in their tunnels, and they allow us to be there because we feed them what they want. What do they want?" Trevorrow's eyes met mine, and I saw something in them that made my blood run cold. Not fear, not exactly. Something worse, resignation. That's the question, isn't it? We think it's fear, terror, the last moments before the stone crushes you. But I've been down there 40 years, and I've felt them watching, and I think it's something else. Something about being trapped in the dark alone, knowing you won't make it out. They feed on that moment. They need it. And one miner per collapse keeps them satisfied. "Jacob Miller," I whispered. "David Hartman. The Schneider brothers. They were the price for the rest of us surviving. Someone always is." 3 days later, the knocking returned to Shaft 3 during the evening shift. 3 clear knocks from the eastern wall, and every Cornish miner immediately evacuated, Thomas Penrose shouting orders. Men scrambling for the main shaft with their lamps and tools. I stood in the middle of the tunnel, watching them go, and I made a decision. If I was marked, if the knockers wanted me specifically, then maybe staying behind would unmark me. Maybe facing them directly would break whatever claim they had on me. I didn't volunteer out loud, that would have been suicide, and I wasn't quite ready to die. But I didn't run either. The tunnel emptied. I was alone. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence, the deep, profound silence of being 200 feet underground, with no other living soul nearby. My lamp cast shadows on the coal walls, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then the knocking started again, but this time it wasn't coming from the wall. It was coming from behind me. Knock, knock, knock. I spun around. Nothing there. Just empty tunnel stretching back toward the main shaft. The knocking came again, further into the mine, deeper into the unexplored sections. Knock, knock, knock. It was calling me, not warning me. Calling me, I realized with sudden terrible clarity what Trevorrow had meant. The knockers don't give warnings. They give invitations. The miners who run aren't escaping. They're being allowed to leave because someone else has been chosen. Someone has to stay behind. Someone has to walk deeper into the dark, and I just volunteered by not running. The knocking came again, further in, insistent now. My feet moved before my brain could stop them, following the sound into sections of Shaft 3 that hadn't been fully mapped yet, where the air tasted different and the walls seemed to press in closer. Knock, 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 deeper, knock, knock, deeper still. I don't know how long I walked. Time moved strangely down there, measured only by my lamp oil and my racing pulse. But eventually, I realized the knocking had synchronized with my heartbeat. Every time my heart beat, the knocking answered, thump-knock, thump-knock. We were connected now. Whatever was making that sound, it was inside me somehow, or I was inside it. I couldn't tell where I ended and it began. Panic finally broke through my stupor. I turned and ran, my lamp swinging wildly, shadows leaping and dancing on the walls. I ran until my lungs burned, until my broken ankle screamed with pain, until I burst back into the main shaft where other miners stood with their lamps, staring at me in shock. "Did you hear it?" I gasped. "The knocking, did you hear it?" They exchanged glances. Thomas Penrose stepped forward, his face grave. We heard nothing, lad. "The tunnel's been silent since you stayed behind." But it was right there. I pointed back into Shaft 3. It was following me. "Nothing's been following you," Penrose said gently. "We've been standing here the whole time. We would have seen." But I knew differently. I knew because I could still hear it, faint now, but present. A steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Thump-knock, thump-knock. Thump-knock. The sound was for me alone now, and that's when I saw him in the corner of Shaft 3. Partially hidden by shadow, stood a figure no taller than a child. His skin was the color of coal dust, black and matte, and his proportions were wrong: arms too long, head too large, fingers that ended in points rather than nails. When my lamplight touched his face, his eyes reflected it back like a cat's. Two circles of yellow-green luminescence that held no pupil, no iris, no humanity. He smiled. His teeth were small and sharp and filed 2 points, like something designed for tearing rather than chewing. He raised one hand, those 2 long fingers, toes pointed tips, and knocked twice on the support beam beside him. Knock, knock, knock. A warning, a greeting. No one else reacted. No one else saw him. The figure stood there in plain sight, smiling his terrible smile, and I understood with sick certainty that this moment was meant only for me. He knocked again, twice more, and then he was gonna not walking away. Not disappearing into shadow, just gone, as if he'd never been there at all. But the sound remained, echoing in my head long after I'd left the mine. Knock, knock. A greeting, an acknowledgement, a promise. They called themselves knockers, but William Trevorrow's grandfather had a different name for them, Bookadoo. The Cornish words for black spirit, and he said they weren't warning us of cave-ins. They were causing them, collapsing tunnels to feed on something in our terror that we don't have words for. Something they've been harvesting from miners for 3,000 years. Trevorrow told me this a week after. I saw the creature in Shaft 3, a week during which I barely slept, barely ate, and spent every waking hour searching for answers that I knew I wouldn't like when I found them. The mine superintendent's office had records going back 15 years. Ledgers and journals and accident reports filed by men who were now dead or gone. I read them all. I read them by lamplight until my eyes burned, looking for patterns, for explanations, for anything that would make sense of what I'd seen. What I found was worse than ignorance. The first reference appeared in a journal entry from 1815, written by a Welsh foreman named David Evans. The men report knocking in the deep shafts. 3 raps. Always 3, before the timber gives way. The Cornish lads say it's the cobbler now, the mine spirits from their home country. They've begun leaving food at the tunnel mouths. I've forbidden it as superstitious nonsense, but the accidents continue. Evans died in a collapse 2 months after writing that entry. His body was never recovered. A German engineer's report from 1818 mentioned a similar phenomena in the silver mines of Saxony. Die Burgester, the mountain ghosts, make their presence known through percussive sounds in the rock. The miners who heed these warnings survive, those who do not perish. The old-timers say the spirits have been in these mountains since before Rome, since before the Celts. Since humans first broke stone to reach metal. I found a letter from a Cornish mine captain in 1822, writing to his brother in Pennsylvania, "The knockers have followed us across the sea. I heard them in the tin mines at home, and now I hear them in the coal seams of America. They are not bound by geography, brother. They are bound by depth. Dig deep enough anywhere on earth, and you will find them waiting." The pattern was undeniable. Everywhere humans mined Cornwall, Wales, Germany, Pennsylvania, the knockers appeared within 2 to 3 years of reaching significant depth. Not just similar spirits or coincidental folklore, but the same phenomenon described in the same way. Following the same rules, they weren't native to any location. They didn't live in the earth. They arrived when humans dug deep enough, drawn by something about the act of extraction itself, about the violence we did to stone and earth and our hunger for metal and coal. We opened doorways into the deep places and they came through. But the most disturbing discovery was in a half-burned journal I found in the bottom of a filing cabinet. Pages brittle with age, written in Cornish with English translations scribbled in the margins. The author was anonymous, but the handwriting matched other documents signed by Trevorrow's grandfather. One passage made my hands shake as I read it. They do not warn us from kindness. They cause the collapses. They select the tunnels, weaken the stone, time the failures with precision. The knocking is not prophesied, is preparation. They are telling us to run because they have already chosen who will stay, and they want the others clear before they feed. What they feed on, I cannot say with certainty. Fear, yes. Terror, certainly. But something deeper than that. Something in the moment when a man realizes he will die alone in the dark, when hope leaves him and only primal horror remains. They harvest that. They need it. And we have made a bargain to supply it, though most miners do not know they have agreed. I sat back in my chair, the journal trembling in my hands. Everything I'd believed about the knockers, that they were guardians, warning spirits, protective entities, was a lie. They were predators. The warnings were just a way to ensure the terror was concentrated, refined, delivered to them pure and undiluted, and I had been marked as their next meal. I needed to see the ritual performed properly, to understand exactly what bargain the Cornish miners had made. So I arrived at Shaft 5 before dawn, while the night shift was ending and the day shift preparing to descend. And I watched William Trevorrow perform his offering. He knelt at the shaft entrance, alone in that gray, pre-dawn light that makes everything look ghostly. In his weathered hands, he held a small tin containing bread, salt, and a piece of dried meat. He set it on the ground just inside the tunnel mouth, then bowed his head and spoke in Cornish, his voice low and rhythmic. I'd been studying the language from books I'd borrowed from the Cornish miners, and I could make out most of what he said. Gorta Avin, Mercy a Bicken, Perthy Ann, Cuntalcoth. Take what you need. Spare what you can. Remember the old compact. But it was the next part that made my blood run cold. Nya Ross da Devs. Ha Taye Ross da Warnins. Unden Rag Lies. Puppers of El. Puppers, we give you your due, and you give us your warnings. One man for many. Always, as always, one man for many. The bargain wasn't just about respect or offerings of food. It was about a quota, a sacrifice. One miner per collapse, offered willingly or taken by force, in exchange for warnings that allowed the others to escape. The Cornish miners had formalized this 3,000 years ago, turned predation into transaction, and carried it across oceans to every mine they worked. Trevorrow finished his prayer, stood slowly, and found me watching from 30 feet away. He didn't seem surprised. "You heard," he said. "One man for many. You're trading lives." "We're surviving," he corrected. "The knockers will take their due whether we cooperate or not. The bargain just gives us some control over who stays behind. A volunteer can make peace with it. A man taken by surprise dies in terror. We try to minimize the terror when we can. That's insane." "That's mining," he said, the same words he'd used before. "You wanted to understand, Samuel. Now you do. The question is what you'll do with that understanding." Before I could answer, we heard voices approaching the day shift, arriving for work. Among them was a boy I hadn't seen before, small and thin and pale, couldn't have been more than 16. He walked with the nervous energy of someone on their first day underground. His eyes wide, his breathing already accelerated. "Who's that?" I asked Trevorrow. "Henry Kellerman. German family just arrived from Philadelphia. Mine company hired him yesterday. First time underground." Trevorrow's face was grim. "He's terrified. I can smell it from here. And don't take him down. Tell him to go home. Tell him mining isn't for him. If he doesn't work, his family doesn't eat. You know how it is." I did know. That was the cruel mathematics of mining towns: work or starve. And sometimes work and starve anyway. Henry Kellerman needed this job, needed the money, needed to prove himself capable. His fear didn't matter. His youth didn't matter. Only the coal mattered. The company's need for men willing to dig it. We descended into Shaft 5 with 20 other miners, Henry Kellerman among them. I watched him in the lamplight, saw how his hands shook when he held his pick, how he jumped at every sound, every creak of timber, every settling of stone. He was wound tight as a spring, ready to snap. Trevorrow saw it too. He positioned himself near Henry, speaking quietly, trying to calm the boy down. But Henry was beyond calming. This was primal fear, the kind that lived in the base of your skull. The certainty that you were descending into your own grave. We'd been working for maybe an hour, and the knocking began. For rapid strikes? Coming from the north wall where Henry was working, knock dash knock dash knock dash knock, the death signal. Every Cornish miner dropped their tools instantly and ran for the main shaft. Trevorrow grabbed my arm, tried to pull me along, but I was watching Henry Kellerman, watching what would happen to a man who'd been selected. "Samuel, we have to," Trevorrow started. "They can smell fear," I said, remembering what he'd told me. "It's what they want, and that boy reeks of it. The collapse is just the delivery mechanism. Now run." But Henry wasn't running. He stood frozen at the coal face, his lamp swinging from nerveless fingers, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. His lips were moving, forming words without sound, and I realized he was hearing something the rest of us couldn't. I shouted, "Henry, move." He turned to look at me, and his face was blank with terror, empty of everything except the knowledge of what was coming. Then he bolted not toward the main shaft where safety waited, but deeper into the mine, into an unmapped side tunnel that we'd been told not to enter, into the dark. The collapse happened 5 seconds later, but it wasn't the main shaft that fell. It wasn't the coal face where we'd been working. It was the side tunnel that Henry had run into, and only that tunnel. The collapse was surgically precise, as if something had calculated exactly which supports to remove, exactly which rock to dislodge. To seal that one tunnel without damaging anything else? We heard Henry scream. Once, then silence. "Dig," Trevorrow ordered, and we dug, tearing at the fallen rock with our bare hands, our picks, our shovels. It took 20 minutes to break through, 20 minutes during which we heard nothing from the other side. No sound of life, No calls for help. When we finally opened a gap, Henry Kellerman crawled through. He was alive. Bruised, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but alive. His lamp was gone, his clothes torn, but he was breathing. He didn't speak. Didn't respond to questions. Just sat on the tunnel floor, staring at nothing, his mouth hanging open, his eyes wide and glassy. We carried him to the surface. The mine doctor examined him and found no serious injuries. Shock, the doctor said. He'll come around when he's ready. Henry didn't speak for 3 days. He sat in his bunk at the boarding house, unmoving, barely eating the food we brought him. Other miners whispered that he'd gone simple, that the collapse had broken something in his mind that wouldn't heal. On the 4th day, I sat with him, trying once more to get him to talk, to explain what had happened in that sealed tunnel. Henry, I said gently, can you tell me what you saw? His eyes focused on me for the first time, and I saw awareness return to them, but not relief, not gratitude for survival. Just a deep, soul-sick horror that made me want to look away. They were eating, he whispered, his voice cracked from disuse. They were eating while I screamed. Eating what? What did you see? Not my body. Something else. Something that came out of me every time I screamed. Like smoke, but not smoke. Like light, but not light. It came out of my mouth, my eyes, and they. They breathed it in. All 7 of them, surrounding me in the dark, breathing in what came out of me. And I could feel myself getting less, getting smaller, like they were taking something I need to be human. He started crying then, silent tears running down his face. I'm still here, but I'm not all here anymore. Part of me is gone, Samuel. They took it. They ate it. And I can feel the hole where it used to be. After that, something changed in me. I stopped trying to escape what was happening and started trying to understand it. I stopped avoiding the mines and began staying underground after my shifts ended, mapping the knocking patterns, documenting every incident, trying to decode what the knockers were doing, because Henry was right, they were feeding on something. Not flesh, not blood, but something else. Something that existed in the moment of absolute terror. Something that humans produced when they faced death alone in the dark. And the knocking patterns were part of how they orchestrated that production. I filled notebooks with observations. 3 knocks equals warning, offer. This gives miners time to evacuate, concentrating the fear in whoever stays behind. 4 knocks equals selection claiming. This is the death signal, the announcement that someone has been chosen. 2 knocks equals greeting, acknowledgement. This is what I'd received recognition from the knockers, that I was marked, that I'd been noticed. But there was one pattern I hadn't witnessed yet. One that the Cornish miners refused to discuss even when I pressed them. 5 knocks. I mentioned it to Trevorrow one evening as we ate dinner in the boarding house, and I watched all color drain from his face. Where did you hear about 5 knocks? He demanded, his voice low and urgent. I figured it out. The pattern. 3, 4, 5. What does 5 mean? He grabbed my wrist, his grip surprisingly strong for a man his age. You never, ever want to hear 5 knocks. Never. You understand? Tell me what it means. It means they're no longer satisfied with fear? It means they want something else. Something more than what they usually take. What could be more than what they took from Henry? Trevorrow's eyes met mine, and in them, I saw a fear deeper than anything I'd encountered in the mines. They usually take your terror and leave you alive. Broken, but alive. 5 knocks means they want all of you. Not just what comes out when you scream, but everything. Your memory, your thoughts, your soul, if such a thing exists. 5 knocks means they're calling you to join them. Join them. How? But Trevorrow wouldn't say more. He released my wrist and stood, leaving his dinner half-eaten. Stop looking for patterns, Samuel. Stop trying to understand. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess. But I couldn't stop. Understanding was the only thing keeping me sane, the only way to feel like I had some control over what was happening to me. So I kept exploring, kept mapping, kept descending into deeper shafts, to document where the knocking came from and what patterns it followed. That's how I found the unmapped shaft. It was in the oldest section of the Wolf Creek complex. A tunnel that wasn't on any company map, that wasn't listed in any survey. The timbers were ancient, rotted almost to nothing, the wood crumbling at a touch. This wasn't from the 1820s. This wasn't even from this century. The walls were covered in symbol spirals, circles, triangles, carved into the coal with crude tools. Not English, not any language I recognized. They looked like the symbols I'd seen in the coal dust under my bed, but more elaborate, more intentional. A written language from before writing existed, or a map to something I didn't want to find. I followed the tunnel deeper, my lamp casting shadows that seemed to move independently of my light. The air changed as I descended, growing colder, taking on a mineral taste that made my teeth ache. This wasn't coal mine air. This was something older. The tunnel ended in a wall of solid rock, but at the base of that wall, there was an opening. A gap barely large enough for a man to crawl through, jagged and rough, as if something had clawed its way out from the other side. I knelt before the opening, my lamp illuminating maybe 5 feet into the darkness beyond. I couldn't see what lay past that point, but I could feel it, a vast space, a void, something that waited with patient hunger. Then I heard them. 5 knocks. Echoing from inside the opening knock, K-N-O-C-K. Knock, knock, knock. 5 knocks. The invitation Trevorrow had warned me about. The call to join them. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to run, to leave this place, to never come back. But I'd been marked. I'd seen them. I'd felt their attention focused on me like a weight pressing down on my chest. Running wouldn't save me. Running would just delay what was already inevitable. I thought of Henry Kellerman, it's broken and hollow, talking about the hole they'd left in him. I thought of Jacob Miller and David Hartman, crushed under falling rock. I thought of Jack Morrison, drowned in impossible water. I thought of the 17, men who died that first winter because they didn't listen fast enough. And I thought, what if understanding is the only way out? What if knowing what they are, what they want, is the only chance I have? I made a choice. I crawled through the opening. The space beyond was not a tunnel, but a chamber. And the walls were not coal, but stone that predated any human mining, smooth and dark, and covered in the same spiral symbols. Thousands of them, carved by hands that had never seen sunlight. The chamber was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Beyond my lamp's reach, in the center of the chamber, stood 7 figures. Each was no taller than a child, perhaps 4 feet tall, with proportions that were wrong in ways my eyes struggled to process. Their limbs were too long, their heads too large, their bodies bent in angles that shouldn't work. They wore clothing, actual miners' clothing. Canvas pants and cotton shirts and leather boots, but the fabric was rotted to threads. Falling apart, ancient beyond measure, they didn't move. They didn't breathe. They simply stood in a circle, facing inward, waiting. I tried to back out, to retreat through the opening I'd entered, but when I turned around, I discovered it had closed. The gap was gone, sealed by solid rock, as if it had never existed. My lamp flickered. I was trapped. One of the figures raised its head. Its face was not a face, but a smooth surface of coal-black stone, featureless except for 2 holes where eyes should be. No nose, no mouth, just those 2 voids that seemed to drink in my lamplight without reflecting it. Then it opened its mouth. The mouth appeared where no mouth had been, splitting the smooth stone surface vertically, revealing darkness inside that went deeper than the figure's head should contain. And from that darkness came the sound, not from its throat, not from vocal cords, but from everywhere at once. Knock. K-N-O-C-K. Knock. K-N-O-C-K. Knock. The sound came from the walls themselves, from the stone, from the earth around me. It resonated in my chest, my bones, my skull. 5 knocks, repeating over and over. echoing and overlapping until it was one continuous sound, like a heartbeat. Made of percussion, the other 6 figures raised their heads. 6 more smooth surfaces of stone, 6 more pairs of void-like eyes, 6 more mouths opening to reveal impossible depths. Knock, knock, K-N-O-C-K, K-N-O-C-K, knock. All of them, knocking in unison. The sound building to a volume that should have deafened me, but instead made everything preternaturally clear. I could hear every resonance, every harmonic, every subtle variation in the pattern, and I understood I hadn't been marked by one of them. I'd been marked by all of them. These 7 figures, these ancient things wearing the clothes of dead miners, had been waiting. Not for someone to stumble into their chamber by accident, but for someone who would voluntarily walk into their domain instead of running away. Someone who sought understanding instead of escape. Someone like me. The knocking stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard one of them speak, not with words, but with images that appeared directly in my mind. You are the first in 43 years to enter willingly. The last was Trevorrow. Before him, others. Always there are some who seek to understand rather than survive. These are the ones we need. Need for what? I whispered aloud, my voice shaking. The answer came in more images. Miners transforming, their bodies hardening to stone. Their humanity slowly replaced with something else. And among them, one figure I recognized, William Trevorrow. But younger, standing in this same chamber, making the same choice I was about to make. Trevorrow hadn't survived 7 collapses. Through luck or respect for the old bargains, he'd survived because he was already one of them. Had been one of them for 43 years, wearing human flesh like a costume, while slowly, gradually, inevitably transforming into a knocker. And now, they wanted me to join them. The 7 figures moved closer, their circle tightening around me. My lamp flickered again, dimming. And in the dying light, I saw their clothes more clearly, different styles, different eras. Centuries of mining fashion represented in their rotting garments. These weren't just ancient spirits. These were men, or had been men, transformed over decades or centuries into something else. You have been chosen, the voice in my mind said. You who seeks to understand. You who stayed when others ran. You who entered when you could have fled. We need those like you. The barrier grows thin. The old compact weakens. New vessels are required to maintain the balance. I don't understand, I said, though I was beginning to, and the understanding was worse than ignorance. You will, the voice promised. In time, you will understand everything. The depth, the hunger, the purpose. And then you will be as we are, neither living nor dead, neither human nor spirit, but something between, something necessary, something that has always been required to keep the deeper things asleep. One of the figures stepped forward and extended its hand toward me. The hand was stone, but it moved with fluid grace, fingers beckoning, offering, inviting. All I had to do was take it, and I would finally understand everything. All I had to do was accept, and the terror would end. All I had to do was join them, and I would never be alone in the dark again. The knocking started again. Softer now, almost gentle. Knock, 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 5 knocks. Always 5, an invitation to become something more than human, or perhaps something less. When I woke, I was back in my bunk in the boarding house. And 3 days had passed, but my fingernails were black with coal dust from a seam that wouldn't be discovered for another 40 years. And carved into my left forearm and scar tissue I had no memory of receiving were the words "we were miners once too." I stared at the words, traced them with my right hand, felt the raised tissue, the infection festering around the edges. The letters were crude, carved with something sharp and rough, a piece of stone perhaps, or a fragment of coal. They looked weeks old, the skin around them angry red and weeping, but that was impossible. 3 days ago I entered that chamber. 3 days ago, my arm was unmarked. I tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. My clothes were shredded, hanging off me in strips. My boots, good leather boots I'd bought just 2 months ago, were worn through at the soles. The leather cracked and aged as if I'd walked 1,000 miles in them. My hands were covered in cuts and bruises, my knuckles scraped raw, my palms calloused in ways that 3 days of work couldn't account for. "Samuel?" A voice from the doorway. Sean O'Connell, his shattered arms still in a sling, staring at me with a mixture of relief and horror. "Jesus Christ, you're awake. We thought we didn't know if you'd ever what happened." My voice was hoarse, my throat raw as if I'd been screaming. "Oh, you don't remember?" I remember entering a chamber. 7 figures. Then nothing. How did I get back here? Sean's face went pale. "Samuel, you never left the mine. We heard you down there for 3 days straight, digging, always digging. We tried to find you, tried to follow the sounds, but every tunnel we checked was empty. It was like you were everywhere and nowhere at once." "That's impossible. I don't remember digging anything. Thomas Penrose said to leave you alone, that you were communing with them, that interfering would be worse. So we just listened. For 3 days. We listened to you digging somewhere in the depths, and then this morning, you were just here, in your bunk, like you'd never left." I looked down at my hands, at the evidence of labor I couldn't remember performing. Under my fingernails wasn't the black, cold dust I'd grown accustomed to, but something different, a deeper black, almost crystalline, that caught the light strangely. The mine doctor later told me it was anthracite from a seam that didn't exist yet, wouldn't exist for decades, from depths we hadn't reached, and shouldn't be able to reach. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I could hear them now, all of them. Not just the knocking meant for me, but every signal in the entire mine complex. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, a constant percussion that filled my head like a drumbeat that never stopped. 3 knocks from shaft 2, 4 knocks from shaft 7, 2 knocks from somewhere deep below the Wolf Creek complex. From tunnels that shouldn't exist, I could map the entire underground network in my mind now. Could feel every shaft, every tunnel, every pocket of space carved into the earth. And I could hear the knockers moving through those spaces, their stone fingers tapping messages to each other, coordinating, planning, waiting. The doctor came later that morning. He examined the carved words in my arm, his face growing more confused with each passing moment. "This is at least a week old," he said finally. "Maybe 2 weeks. The infection has progressed too far for this to be a fresh wound." "But you're saying you only entered the mine 3 days ago?" "I'm saying I don't remember anything after entering the chamber." He cleaned and bandaged the wound, gave me laudanum for the pain, told me to rest. But his eyes kept returning to those carved words, to the message left by something that wanted me to understand. We were miners once too. William Trevorrow came to see me that evening. He dismissed Sean and the other miners who'd been keeping watch, closed the door, and sat on the edge of my bunk with the heaviness of a man carrying unbearable weight.
"Oh, yes."
"You went to the chamber," he said. "Not a question. A statement of fact. You knew I would. I hoped you wouldn't. But yes, I knew. The marked ones always find it eventually. We're drawn to it, pulled by something we can't resist." He paused, his weathered hands clasping and unclasping. I went there too. 43 years ago, we're the only 2 who've ever come back. Come back? I touched the words on my arm. Did I come back, Trevorrow? Or did something else come back wearing my face? You came back. For now, but you're changing, Samuel. I can see it in your eyes, hear it in your voice. The transformation has begun, and once it starts, it doesn't stop. It just takes time, years, decades, but it's inevitable. Act. What are they? I demanded. What are the knockers really? Trevorrow stood and walked to the window, staring out at the mine, heads visible in the distance, smoke rising from their shafts into the gray sky. They were miners, he said finally. Ancient miners, from when the first humans dug into the earth for flint and copper. Before bronze, before iron, before recorded history, they dug too deep. Broke into spaces that should have stayed sealed. And something down there changed them. Changed them how? Preserved them. Transformed them. Made them dependent on what we produce when we're terrified and alone in the dark. They can't die now, but they can't live either. Not as we understand living. They're trapped in a state between neither fully physical nor fully spirit, bound to the deep places, feeding on human fear to maintain their existence. I thought of the 7 figures in the chamber, their rotting clothes from different centuries. How long have they been down there? The ones you saw? They were Cornish miners from the 1600s. I recognized one of them from descriptions in my grandfather's journals. A man named John Tremaine, who disappeared in a collapse in 1634. 300 years he's been down there, Samuel. 300 years, still conscious, still aware, still human enough to remember his name and his life before. But his body won't die, and he can't return to the surface. The sunlight would destroy him now. He's become something that can only exist in darkness. The horror of it settled over me like a weight. Every miner who disappears and collapses isn't dead. Not immediately. They're transforming. The process takes years, decades, trapped alone in sealed tunnels. In spaces between the rock where oxygen shouldn't exist but somehow does, they're conscious through all of it, feeling their flesh hardened to stone, their humanity slowly replaced with something else. And when the transformation is complete, they join the others. They become knockers themselves, bound to the deep places, feeding on the fear of the miners who come after them. Why? My voice cracked. Why would they do this to others? If they remember being human, if they know what it's like, why perpetuate it? Because they have no choice, Trevorrow said quietly. Because the hunger is stronger than memory. Because they need us to survive, and survival trumps compassion when you've been alone in the dark for centuries. He turned back to face me. You felt it in the chamber, didn't you? The pull, the promise that you'd never be alone again, that you'd finally understand everything. That's what they offer: knowledge, purpose, belonging. In an exchange, you just have to give up your humanity slowly, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but the hunger. I looked down at the words carved in my arm. You've been one of them for 43 years. He nodded slowly. I entered the chamber in 1785. I was 21 years old, working the tin mines in Cornwall. I made the same choice you're facing now, and I've regretted it every day since. But I'm still here, still Samuel Trevorrow, still holding on to my humanity by my fingernails. It takes decades for the full transformation. Maybe longer if you fight it. I've been fighting it for 43 years, and I can feel myself losing. Another decade, maybe 2, and I'll be like them standing in that chamber, waiting for the next fool who thinks understanding is worth the price. How much time do I have? I don't know. Everyone's different. But the signs will come. Your skin will start to harden. Your need for food and water will diminish. Light will begin to hurt your eyes. And the knocking, he paused. The knocking will become part of you. You'll start making the sounds yourself without meaning to, tapping out patterns with your fingers, hearing messages in every percussion. Eventually, you won't be able to distinguish between your own thoughts and theirs. The knocking started that night. Not just in my head, but everywhere. It began in shaft 4, the 3 sharp raps that I heard from my bunk, despite being 200 yards away. Then shaft 2, then shaft 7, then all of them at once. Cacophony of knocking that rolled through the mine complex like thunder. Mine, Superintendent Harrison, ordered an immediate evacuation. Every miner underground was pulled to the surface, every shift canceled, every tunnel abandoned. But the knocking didn't stop. It followed us above ground. Miners began reporting knocking in their homes, in their walls, in their floors, in their ceilings. The town's church heard knocking during evening prayer, 3 steady raps that came from the altar itself. The tavern's owner swore he heard knocking coming from inside sealed whiskey barrels. The company's store heard it in their storerooms, among sacks of flour and crates of tools. But only certain men heard it. Only men who'd worked underground. Only men who'd been marked by the depths. Within 2 days, 17 miners had gone mad. They stood in the streets, knocking on their own chests, their heads, the walls of buildings, echoing patterns they claimed to hear in the rock beneath the town. Some tried to dig through the floors of their homes with bare hands, insisting they needed to get back down, needed to answer the call, needed to return to the deep places. I watched from my boarding house window as the town descended into chaos, and I understood with sick certainty what had happened. I'd broken something in the chamber. By entering willingly, by accepting their invitation, even temporarily, I'd weakened the barrier that kept them contained to the mines. Now they were reaching up, extending their influence, calling to every man who'd ever descended into their domain. The knockers weren't confined to the underground anymore, and it was my fault. On the third night of the plague, I returned to the mine alone. I had to. Whatever I'd done, whatever I'd broken, I needed to fix it, or at least understand it. The hidden shaft was easy to find now. I could feel it in my bones. A magnetic pull that guided me through abandoned tunnels to that ancient space with its rotted timbers and carved symbols. The opening at the base of the wall was there again, waiting, as if it had never closed. I crawled through without hesitation this time. I'd already paid whatever price was required for entry. The chamber was exactly as I remembered, 30 feet across, covered in spiral symbols, 7 figures standing in a circle. But now I noticed something I'd missed before. There was space for an 8th figure, an empty spot in the circle, perfectly sized for a man of my height and build. Waiting for me, the 7 figures didn't move as I entered, but I felt their attention focus on me like a physical weight. And I understood now, not through words, but through direct knowledge that appeared in my mind, what they wanted. What they'd always wanted. They wanted me to join them willingly, to accept the transformation knowingly, to become the first miner in 3,000 years to choose this fate rather than having it forced upon him. If I agreed, the knocking would stop, the barrier would be restored, the town would be spared, mining could continue, and the old bargains would hold for another generation. If I refused, the knockers would continue reaching upward, calling to every marked miner, transforming them one by one, whether they wanted it or not. The town would fall, the mines would be abandoned, and eventually everyone who'd ever descended into those depths would hear the call and answer it. Willingly or not, it wasn't really a choice. It was an ultimatum, dressed as an offer. I stood in the center of that ancient chamber, surrounded by figures who were once men like me, and I asked the question I'd been afraid to ask since that first collapse. Why? My voice echoed off stone walls. Why do you need us at all? The answer came not in words, but in images that flooded my mind with devastating clarity. The earth itself was alive. Not sentient in the way humans are sentient, but aware in some vast, incomprehensible way. And for millions of years, it had slept peacefully, its slow dreams undisturbed by the creatures that crawled across its surface. But then humans began to dig, to mine, to extract, to carve into its flesh for metal and coal and precious stones, and the earth felt that. Felt every tunnel, every shaft, every ton of ore, removed as pain, as violation, as wounding. That pain accumulated, built up, concentrated in the places where humans dug deepest, where the extraction was most violent. And if that pain wasn't shared, distributed, released in small doses, it would eventually reach a critical mass. It would wake something older than the knockers, older than humanity, older than life on the surface, something that slept in the spaces between tectonic plates, in the pressures and temperatures where rock becomes liquid, where the Earth's true power resided. Something that dreamed of the surface world with the patient hunger of geological time. The knockers weren't the danger. They were the buffer, the pressure valve. They took the Earth's pain, took miners one by one, fed on their fear, distributed the suffering so it never concentrated enough to wake the thing beneath. They were performing a service, had been performing it for 3,000 years, protecting humanity from something we couldn't even comprehend. And if they stopped, if they couldn't take enough miners, couldn't feed enough on human terror, couldn't distribute the Earth's pain, then the thing beneath would wake, and it would take everyone at once. I saw images of entire cities swallowed by earthquakes, of mountains collapsing, of the ground itself opening up like a mouth to consume everything on the surface. Not the distant future. Soon, within a generation. Within years, the knockers were the only thing standing between humanity and the wrath of a wounded planet. I looked at the empty eighth space in that chamber, at the figures who were once men like me, and I heard my own voice say words I don't remember choosing. How long will I remain myself? The answer came immediately, and it was the worst answer possible. Long enough to regret this. Images flooded my mind again, aids of slowly transforming. Of feeling my flesh hardened to stone while my mind remained intact. Of standing in this chamber for centuries, watching new miners enter and make the same choice. Of losing my humanity piece by piece, while retaining just enough consciousness to remember what I'd lost. 40 years, maybe 50. That's how long I'd remain Samuel Webb. Long enough to watch everyone I knew die. Long enough to forget what sunlight felt like, what food tasted like, what it meant to be warm. Long enough to become intimately acquainted with every form of regret that existed. And then, after those decades of slow death, I'd finally become what they weren't either alive nor dead, neither human nor spirit. Just hunger and duty, and the endless task of taking miners one by one to keep the deeper thing asleep. The 7 figures waited. For my answer, the empty space waited to be filled, and somewhere far below, in spaces between tectonic plates where pressure turned rock to liquid, something older than time continued its slow dreaming, waiting to see if these small creatures on the surface would continue to placate it with their sacrifices, or if it would finally be time to wake up and remind them who truly owned this world. I opened my mouth to answer, and I still don't know if the words that came out were mine or theirs. William Trevorrow died at dawn on the 14th of March, 1828. But he'd been dead for 43 years before that time, I know, because I found his original death certificate, dated 1785, in the Cornish mining records, listing him as collapsed upon, body not recovered. And I understood then that the man I'd been taking advice from was exactly what he'd warned me I would become. I spent 2 days in the company office, going through every record I could find. My hands shook as I turned the yellowed pages, but not from fear, from the sick certainty of what I was about to discover. Thomas Penrose. Death certificate from Dulcoath Mine, Cornwall, 1791. Cause: crushed in fall of ground. Body never recovered. Richard Hosking. Died in Consolidated Mines, Cornwall, 1803. Lost to flooding in lower workings. John Trembeth. Perished in Levant Mine, 1816. Suffocated by bad air. Every single Cornish miner who'd taught me the rules, who'd survived impossible collapses, who'd guided us through the darkness with their strange rituals, all of them had death. Records from decades before they'd supposedly arrived in Pennsylvania. I confronted Penrose that evening as he prepared to descend for the night shift. He looked at me with those dark, reflective eyes. How had I not seen it before? And simply nodded. "Took you long enough, Samuel," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "Most never figure it out." "How many?" I demanded. "How many of you are there?" "In this region, 14 of us. Worldwide." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Someone has to maintain the bargain. Someone has to remember how it's done." I grabbed his arm. It felt wrong. Too cool, too hard beneath the fabric of his shirt. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Why? Let me think. I had a choice." "Because you do have a choice," Penrose said quietly. "We all did, once. Trevorrow chose 43 years ago. I chose 37 years ago. And now, it's your turn." That night, Trevorrow's body was found in his bunk at the boarding house. But it wasn't a body, not really. It had crumbled to coal dust and small fragments of what might have been bone or might have been stone. The boarding house keeper swept it up like any other mining debris, not understanding she was disposing of a man who'd been holding himself together through sheer will for longer than she'd been alive. They buried the dust in an unmarked grave outside town. Only the Cornish miners attended. Only they understood what it meant that the system demanded renewal. That even the transformed eventually deteriorate. That there must always be new volunteers to replace the old. The bargain was never about offerings or rules. Those were just the rituals that made us feel like we had some control. The real bargain was simpler and more terrible. To keep the deeper horror at bay, some of us had to become the horror. To prevent the earth from taking everyone, a few had to give themselves completely. The knocking began at sunset on the 15th of March, and didn't stop. It came from everywhere, from the mine shafts. Yes, but also from the boarding houses, the company store, the church basement. Every man who'd worked underground heard it, a constant hammering that drove into our skulls like spikes. By midnight, 3 miners had tried to claw their own ears off. By dawn, 17 men had gone completely mad. They attacked their wives, their children. Screaming about the sounds beneath the floorboards, the knocking inside the walls, the town constable had to lock them in the church basement, where their howls mixed with the phantom, knocking only they could hear. The mine superintendent brought in investigators from Philadelphia, doctors who examined us, listened to our chests, checked our eyes. They heard nothing. The knocking was real only to those who'd been marked, a sound that existed in whatever space the knockers occupied between the living and the dead. Penrose found me on the 2nd day, his face grim. 3 days until the new moon, Samuel. That's all the time you have? Or what? I shouted over the knocking that wouldn't stop. Everyone goes mad? The whole town transforms? Worse. He pulled me into an empty shaft house where the sound was marginally quieter. I've seen it happen. 9 times in 9 different towns across 3 centuries. When there's no one to maintain the balance, the marked ones all transform at once, but not gradually, not with any consciousness remaining. They become something else entirely. Something that doesn't remember being human. Something that causes collapses not to warn, but to feed. He showed me a map, marked with 9 locations towns in Cornwall, Wales, Germany, and 3 in America. These places aren't on any modern map, he said. They were abandoned between 1680 and 1810. In each one, the mining stopped suddenly. The official records say plague, or economic failure, or vein depletion. But I was there for 2 of them. I know what really happened. He described towns where every miner transformed simultaneously, where the creatures that emerged were mindless and hungry, where the collapses spread from the mines to the town itself, swallowing everything until nothing remained but sinkholes and silence. If you refuse, Penrose said, Schuylkill County becomes the 10th. And unlike those other towns, this region has thousands of miners, not hundreds. The scale of the transformation would be catastrophic. I looked at him, this thing wearing the shape of a man, this creature that had once made the same choice now facing me. Why me? Why not one of you? Because we're failing, he said simply. Trevorrow lasted 43 years. I've been holding on for 37, but I can feel myself deteriorating. Every year it gets harder to remember, harder to care, harder to knock 3 times instead of 4. The system needs someone new, someone who still remembers what it feels like to be human enough to want to save others. I found Henry Kellerman at the edge of town, staring at the mine entrance from a safe distance. The young miner who'd survived the collapse that had killed others, who'd spent 3 days unable to speak after his encounter with the knockers. You're going to do it, aren't you? He said without looking at me. You're going to go down there and let them take you. I don't see another choice, I admitted. There's always another choice. Henry turned to face me, and I saw the anger in his eyes and I wished I still had. You can refuse. We all can. Every marked miner in this region could walk away, leave the mines, force them to find someone else. And then what? Humanity stops mining? We stop going deeper. I shook my head. You know that won't happen. There are coal seams here that could power the nation for 100 years. If we abandon them, others will come. Others who don't know the rules, don't understand the bargain. The deaths will be worse. So you sacrifice yourself to perpetuate the system? Henry's voice cracked. That's exactly what they want you to think. That you're the only solution. That without you, everything collapses. Maybe it does, I said quietly. Maybe that's the truth. They don't want us to know that the system works because people like me believe it's necessary. We stood in silence, listening to the knocking that only we could hear. Finally, Henry spoke again. My father was a miner in Wales. He told me about the Coblanow, their version of the knockers. He said his grandfather made the same choice you're making. And you know what happened? 20 years later, they needed another volunteer, and then another. The system never ends, Samuel. It just consumes. I know, I said, but if my sacrifice buys even one generation of relative safety, if it means your children can work these mines without going mad or transforming, isn't that worth it? Henry looked at me with something like pity. You really believe that, don't you? That one more body thrown into the darkness will finally be enough. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to believe there was another way. But I'd seen the records, heard the knocking, watched Trevorrow crumble to dust. The pattern was clear, and it had been repeating for 3,000 years. Either I became part of the system, or the system consumed everyone I knew. Yes, I said. I believe it. I descended alone on the night of the new moon, carrying only a leather journal containing everything I'd learned, the patterns, the history, the terrible truth about what the knockers really were. I left it at the entrance to the hidden shaft, wedged between two support timbers where the next person might find it. Maybe they'd read it and make a different choice. Maybe they'd understand what I couldn't. The chamber was waiting exactly as I'd left it. The 7 figures stood motionless in the darkness, their coal-black faces reflecting my lamplight like polished stone. The 8th space remained empty, a gap in their circle, a vacancy that had been waiting decades for someone to fill it. I stepped into the empty space. The transformation began immediately, but not the way I'd imagined. There was no pain, no violence, just a gradual cooling, a hardening, as if my body was slowly remembering it had always been stone and was simply returning to its natural state. My skin darkened first, taking on the texture of anthracite. Then my bones hardened, fusing together until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. My breath came slower, then slower still, until I realized I didn't need to breathe anymore. But the worst part, or perhaps the best part, was the expansion of my senses. Suddenly, I could feel every tunnel in the entire region, every shaft, every seam. I could sense the miners moving through the darkness like glowing points of warmth and fear. I could feel the earth itself, its ancient pain, its slow rage at being carved and hollowed. And I understood, finally, what the knockers had been trying to tell me all along. We weren't just warning miners of danger. We were redistributing the Earth's suffering, spreading it out across thousands of small collapses instead of one catastrophic awakening. We were the buffer between humanity's hunger for what lay beneath and the sleeping thing that waited in the deepest dark. My last truly human thought, before consciousness began to shift into something else entirely, was this: I can still warn them. I can still help them survive. Maybe that's enough. The knocking stopped in Schuylkill County that spring. Mining continued for another 150 years. The old-timers said the knockers were gone. It's driven out by progress and electric lights and modern ventilation, but they were wrong. We never left. We're still here in every deep mine, in every dark shaft, in every moment just before the stone gives way. And when you hear 3 knocks in the darkness, you should know it's not a warning from something other than human. It's a warning from something that used to be human. Something that remembers what it's like to have a family waiting above ground. Something that doesn't want you to end up like us. So when you hear those 3 knocks, you run. You always run, because the 4th knock means we've already chosen who stays behind. And by the time you hear the 5th knock, it means you've been alone in the dark long enough to start changing. And you just haven't noticed yet. My name was Samuel Webb. I was 24 years old when I descended. By human reckoning, I've been down here for 196 years. I can still remember my mother's face. I can still remember sunlight in every single day. I knock 3 times on the walls of these mines, and I pray that today someone finally listens fast enough.